Alice's weekends were usually the same. She had no plans to relax or socialise. There were always reports to comb through, her jog in the afternoon to clear her mind, and maybe a cup of tea to round out the day. But as she set her coffee mug down and reached for the first stack of papers, a knock at the door interrupted her routine. She frowned, glancing toward the door. What's with all the knocking lately? When she opened the door, she was met with an unusual sight. Ethan standing awkwardly, his hands shoved into his pockets, and Lily looking up at her with wide, expectant eyes. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Ethan cleared his throat. "Morning, Alice. Sorry to bother you. I know it's early." Alice's brow furrowed, her gaze shifting to Lily, who was clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly against her chest. "What is it?" Alice asked, her voice even. Ethan sighed, glancing down at Lily. She wanted to see Willow. She's been talking about her all morning." Lily looked up at Alice, her expression hopeful but nervous. "Just a quick hello," Ethan added hastily. "Then we'll leave you to your day." Alice hesitated, her thoughts racing. But before she could respond, Lily's face crumpled. Lily's lower lip trembled as she looked down at her feet. Is Willow gone?" she whispered. Alice's heart twisted at the sight. She wasn't used to seeing children cry, not up close, not in a way that felt this raw and personal. "No," Alice said quickly, crouching slightly to meet Lily's gaze. "Willow's not gone. She's just out for her morning stroll." Lily sniffled, her wide eyes glistening with tears. "But what if she doesn't come back?" Alice swallowed, caught off guard by the wave of protectiveness that surged through her. She wasn't good at comforting people, especially children, but in that moment she couldn't bear to see Lily so upset. "She'll come back. She always does." Lily stared at her for a moment, her sniffles quieting as Alice's words seemed to sink in. Behind her, Ethan exhaled softly, his shoulders relaxing. "Sorry about this," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "She's been pretty attached to Willow since yesterday." "It's fine," Alice said, surprising herself with the softness in her tone. "I understand." Ethan smiled faintly, his usual confidence replaced by something quieter, almost uncertain. "Tell you what," he said, crouching to Lily's level. "How about we go for a walk in the park? Maybe we'll run into Willow there." Lily perked up slightly, glancing between Ethan and Alice. Can she come too?" she asked, her voice small but hopeful. Alice blinked, startled by the invitation. She opened her mouth to refuse. It wasn't her idea of a Saturday morning, and she had work waiting for her. But then she looked at Lily. The little girl's eyes were wide, her hopefulness almost tangible. Alice hesitated, her words catching in her throat. "I don't—" Ethan raised a hand, his tone easy. "No pressure." Alice felt torn. She wasn't used to being included in things like this, and the idea of spending the morning with her neighbour and his niece felt unnervingly personal. But the sight of Lily's small, hopeful smile tipped the scales. "Okay," Alice said finally, her voice quieter than usual. "A walk sounds fine." Lily's face lit up, and Ethan smiled, genuine and warm in a way that made Alice's chest tighten slightly. "Great," he said, gesturing toward the sidewalk. "Let's go." Alice stepped outside, closing the door behind her. As the three of them started down the street, the faintest flicker of something, connection maybe, began to take root. Alice had always believed her life was better when kept in neat compartments: work, home, solitude. But over the past few weeks, those lines had started to blur. It began with Lily visiting Willow, a routine that had grown from shy curiosity into a regular occurrence, and it didn't stop there. Alice found herself accompanying Ethan and Lily to the park on sunny afternoons, her protests ignored with the kind of confidence only a child could pull off. Before she knew it, Lily had become a fixture in her once quiet world, her laughter filling spaces Alice had long since grown accustomed to leaving empty. That's why Alice wasn't entirely surprised when Mrs. Wainwright appeared on her doorstep one morning, beaming and holding something lilac in her hands. "Alice, dear," Mrs. Wainwright's voice rang out, far too cheerful for the hour. Alice glanced at the clock. Too late to pretend she wasn't home. She set her coffee down and opened the door. "I just had to catch you," Mrs. Wainwright said, her smile as bright as ever. She held up a small dress, the soft lilac fabric catching the morning light. "Look at this. I bought it for Lily. Isn't it adorable?" Alice blinked at the dress. It was beautiful, delicate embroidery tracing the hem. She reached out, brushing her fingers over the fabric, though she wasn't sure what else to do. "It is beautiful, Mrs. Wainwright," she said at last. "Now that Ethan has won guardianship of that darling little girl, I can't wait for the welcome party for Lily at my house." Mrs. Wainwright continued, beaming. "She needs to meet other children, don't you think?" Alice nodded politely, her mind already racing for an exit strategy. "And you've been such a help to Ethan and Lily," Mrs. Wainwright added, her tone turning sly, her smile knowing. "And Ethan, well, isn't he just handsome?" Alice felt heat rise to her cheeks. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, Mrs. Wainwright's laugh rang out like a bell. "Oh, I'm only teasing, dear," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "See you at the party." And just like that, she was gone, leaving Alice standing in the doorway, holding a small lilac dress, and wondering how she had let herself get roped into all of this. Later that day, Lily came over to play with Willow, a thinly veiled excuse, Alice suspected, to spend time at her house. Alice had decided, for reasons she still couldn't explain, to try her hand at pancakes. It was a simple enough task, or so she thought. The first pancake stuck to the pan. The second burned beyond recognition. The third was a crumpled heap that Alice scraped into the sink with a muttered curse. By the time the kitchen was filled with smoke, Lily was giggling uncontrollably from the table, her laughter cutting through Alice's growing frustration. "It smells like disappointment," came Ethan's voice from the doorway, his tone carrying that familiar note of amusement. Alice spun around, glaring at him. "The pancakes keep sticking. It's a nightmare." Ethan grinned, rolling up his sleeves with the kind of confidence that suggested he had solved bigger problems than a temperamental frying pan. "Move over. I'll show you how it's done." Within minutes, the pan was heating perfectly, and Ethan was flipping pancakes into the air like a practiced chef. Lily clapped her hands, her face lighting up with delight as Ethan tossed one pancake high and caught it effortlessly. "Show her how to do it," Lily urged, her eyes gleaming with excitement. Alice crossed her arms, unimpressed. "This feels like a trap." "It's not," Ethan said innocently, handing her the pan. "It's all in the wrist." Alice shot him a skeptical look, but took the pan anyway. She concentrated, mimicking the movement he had shown her. The pancake flipped, halfway, before landing unceremoniously on the stove in a crumpled heap. "I'll stick to law," Alice muttered, but a small smile tugged at her lips, one she didn't bother hiding this time. That evening, the three of them played games and watched a string of children's songs over at Ethan's house. Lily had protested at first, insisting she didn't need to sleep, but exhaustion had finally won. Her stuffed rabbit was tucked under one arm, her dark curls spread across the pillow. Alice lingered for a moment, brushing a strand of hair from Lily's forehead. "Good night, Lily," she whispered, her voice softer than she remembered it could be. Alice sat on the living room floor, her back resting against the couch, while Ethan lounged nearby, a bottle of wine and 2 glasses between them. "You've been quiet," Ethan said, his voice softer now, his eyes watching her. "I was just thinking." Alice hesitated, swirling the wine in her glass. "How long it's been since I felt like this." Ethan tilted his head, his gaze steady but curious. "Like what?" Alice glanced down, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like I'm not alone." The words hung in the air, and for a moment she regretted saying them, but Ethan didn't press or prod. Instead, he poured more wine into her glass and waited, his silence urging her forward in a way words never could. Alice hesitated, then began to speak. The words came slowly, haltingly, about her marriage, the pain of losing pregnancies, and the anger that had consumed her until there was nothing left of the life she had once envisioned. Tears stung her eyes, and she wiped them away quickly, but Ethan reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before resting gently on hers. "It's okay," he said, his voice low and warm. "You've been a mystery to me since I moved in. I'm glad you're sharing this with me." Alice nodded, her throat tightening as she looked at him. "What about you?" she asked quietly. "Why no real relationships? Just dates?" Ethan leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "My parents divorced when I was a kid. It was messy, painful. I swore I'd never put myself or anyone else through that. But my brother, he believed in love, married his high school sweetheart. Lily..." Ethan's voice wavered slightly, and he paused before continuing. "Lily is the fruit of that happiness." "And then life has a way of..." Ethan began, his voice trailing off. Alice's expression shifted, her tone quieter, as she finished the thought for him. "Taking away." "Shifting," he said softly, meeting her eyes. "Not taking away, just changing paths." "So you chose freedom and no responsibility, unlike your brother? We're not so different after all," Alice said, her voice carrying an edge that she wasn't sure she intended. Ethan met her gaze, his expression calm, though something flickered beneath it, a weight she recognized but didn't want to name. Alice felt the flicker of anger at the losses in her life rise unbidden, sharp and sudden, before she forced it back down. It was easier to mask her emotions with teasing than to confront the truth he was trying to make her face. "Maybe, but I choose to have people in my life. Choosing loneliness is, well, lonely," Ethan said, his voice steady, though there was something unshakable in his tone. Alice knew exactly what Ethan was doing. He was good at this, chipping away at her defenses, nudging her to break down the walls she had spent years building. But she wasn't about to give in that easily. Teasing him was safer, easier. Is that why you get them to stay the night? Or is it that you haven't perfected the art of making excuses to get them to leave yet? Ethan's grin widened, the corners of his eyes crinkling as he leaned back slightly, clearly amused by her deflection. Like I said, I choose to have people around, he replied. Alice smirked, running her fingers through her hair and sweeping it to one side, her tone turning mockingly dramatic. Well, I suppose I'm one of the chosen ones then, Ethan. Ethan's eyes flickered with something unspoken as he moved closer, the playful banter giving way to a deeper intensity. Why do I feel like I'm the chosen one instead? For a moment, Alice hesitated. The air between them seemed to change, charged with something she hadn't felt in years, something she wasn't sure she wanted to feel. Ethan's gaze held hers, steady and patient, even as he started to pull back, as if giving her the space to decide. But Alice didn't want space, not in that moment. Before she could talk herself out of it, she reached for him, her hand brushing against his as she leaned forward, drawing him closer. When their lips met, the kiss was tentative at first, a question neither of them dared to ask aloud. But as it deepened, it became something more, an answer, a bridge between all the things they couldn't bring themselves to say. And as their walls crumbled, his hesitations, her fears, they found something neither of them had expected. That night, they shared more than intimacy. They shared a connection that neither of them had thought possible. Alice stirred, her head resting against the arm of Ethan's couch. The warmth of his arm, draped securely across her waist, was the first thing she noticed. The second was the quiet, broken only by the soft hum of the radiator and the faint creak of the old house settling into the morning. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she didn't move. The events of the night before rushed back with an almost physical force. The laughter that had flowed too freely, the confessions that had felt too raw, the kiss that had unravelled the defences she had spent years building, and then what came after, the intimacy that had felt too natural, too effortless for someone like her. Regret coiled tight in her chest. This wasn't just complicated, it was everything she had sworn to avoid. Slowly, she shifted, slipping out from under Ethan's arm with careful precision, the absurdity of tiptoeing in his home not lost on her. She sat up, her feet brushing the rug as she tried to steady her thoughts. But before she could gather herself, she felt his gaze. "Hey," Ethan murmured, his voice thick with sleep. His smile was soft, unguarded, and completely at odds with the knot twisting in her stomach. He looked at ease, as though waking up like this, with her, was the most natural thing in the world. For him, maybe it was. But for her, it wasn't. "I should check on Lily," she said, her voice firmer than she intended. The words cut through the moment like a sharp edge, and she stood before he could respond. Ethan sat up, rubbing the back of his neck, his hair dishevelled from sleep. "I'll come with you." Before either of them could move, Lily's bright voice called from upstairs, carrying through the stillness. "Uncle Ethan, Alice, where are you?" Alice reached the hallway first, her steps purposeful, as if she could outrun the mess of emotions still clinging to her. Lily stood at the top of the stairs, Her stuffed rabbit clutched tight against her chest. Her dark curls were a wild tangle, and her small face lit up the moment she spotted them. "I was looking for you," she exclaimed, her voice small but certain. "And Uncle Ethan, is Willow here?" Alice exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly at Lily's question. Simple, untainted by the complexities that weighed on adults. "Good morning, Lily," Alice said, her tone softening as she crouched to meet the child's eye level. "Willow's probably out on her morning stroll, but she'll be back soon." Lily's brow furrowed, her lip trembling slightly. But what if she doesn't come back? Ethan crouched beside her, his voice low and soothing. "She always comes back, sweetheart. Willow loves this house, and she loves you too." Lily sniffled, her tears threatening to spill over. Alice reached out, her hand brushing gently against Lily's shoulder. "I promise Willow will come back. She always finds her way home," she said, her voice calm but certain. After a long pause, Lily nodded, though the doubt lingered in her wide eyes. Convincing Lily to let go of Willow turned out to be harder than Alice had anticipated. The little girl clung to the cat as though her entire morning depended on keeping Willow in her arms. Ethan's gentle coaxing did little to help. "Lily, sweetheart, you can't carry her around all day. She needs a break too." "But she likes it," Lily protested, holding Willow closer, her curls bouncing with indignation. Alice crouched beside her, her tone patient but firm. "Willow's used to her freedom, Lily. She'll come back to you, I promise. But for now, she needs to stretch her legs." Lily's lips pressed into a pout, her grip on Willow loosening reluctantly. The sleek black cat, sensing her chance, slipped gracefully from Lily's arms and sauntered toward the back door with a flick of her tail. "See?" Alice said softly. "She'll be back soon. She always is." Lily hesitated, her small shoulders sagging in defeat, before she turned her bright eyes back to Alice. "Okay, but only if she promises." Alice smiled despite herself, reaching out to gently ruffle Lily's curls. "I'm sure she would, if she could." "Thanks for helping this morning," Ethan said as they stood by the front door, his voice low enough that Lily, still playing with her stuffed rabbit in the living room, wouldn't overhear. "It's fine," Alice replied, her tone clipped, but not unkind. "She's sweet." Ethan smiled, a slow, easy smile that lingered far longer than it should have. Alice shifted her weight, suddenly uncomfortable under his gaze. "I should get going. I'm already running late." He nodded, stepping back slightly but not taking his eyes off her. "Of course." Alice hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing against her before she turned and stepped out into the crisp morning air. Alice slid into her car. She realized she was late, something that had never happened before. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her attention to the notifications lighting up the screen. A few missed calls, and at the top, a message from George, her boss. "George, just checking if everything's all right. It's unlikely for you to not show up." Alice exhaled sharply, her fingers hovering over the screen as the familiar knot of anxiety tightened in her chest. Being late wasn't just unusual for her, it was unthinkable. Punctuality and precision were the pillars of the reputation she had built, and the concern in George's message only deepened her unease. "Sorry," she typed back. "Be there soon. Nothing to worry about. Just got delayed." She sent the reply and stared at the screen for a moment longer than necessary, the weight of the exchange lingering. George wasn't just her boss. He was one of the few people Alice felt genuinely valued her. Not for small talk or charm, she had none, but for the results she delivered. He believed in her, and she had always ensured that belief stayed firmly rooted in professionalism. It was easier that way, safer, simpler. But this morning had unravelled that carefully crafted simplicity. As she started the car, her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles pale against the leather. Work was supposed to be her sanctuary, the one place where everything made sense, where her competence shielded her from the chaos of emotions. There, she could measure her worth in clean metrics, deadlines met, negotiations closed, deals secured. This morning had been different. Her mind kept drifting, unbidden, back to Ethan's living room. The warmth of his arm draped across her waist, the soft rasp of his voice saying, "Hey," as though waking up beside her was something natural, something expected. And then there was Lily. Her bright, unrestrained laughter still echoed in Alice's ears, breaking through her usual morning routine like sunlight piercing through clouds. Alice shook her head sharply, as if the act alone could banish the memories. She muttered aloud, her voice firm, almost scolding herself. "Focus, Alice. Reports, deadlines, work." Compartmentalizing had always been her strength. Memories and emotions were meant to be boxed away, labelled neatly, and shelved in the farthest corners of her mind. But this morning had stirred something that refused to be filed away. By the time she parked at the office, Alice felt her composure fraying at the edges. Her heels clicked sharply against the pavement as she walked toward the building, each step purposeful, measured. The familiar weight of her briefcase against her shoulder was a small comfort, a tangible reminder of the life she had built, a life that made sense, a life she controlled. She told herself the morning didn't matter. Ethan's sleepy smile, Lily's infectious laughter, the fleeting softness she had felt. It was just a moment, a distraction. But even as she stepped into the polished, sterile environment of her office, the truth lingered, quiet and persistent, in the corners of her mind. For once, something outside of work had disrupted her perfectly ordered world. And for a change, she wasn't entirely sure if she regretted it. When Alice saw the message from her mother, her stomach tightened. "Mum, just confirming my visit this weekend. Can't wait to see you, darling." It wasn't a surprise. Her mother's annual visit was as routine as the seasons, a promise she had never missed in over a decade. But that didn't make it any easier. Alice stared at the message for a moment, her thumb hovering over the screen. The words were cheerful, the exclamation points carefully placed, as if they could bridge the gaps left by years of distance. Her mother's visits were always the same, polite, strained, and riddled with unspoken words. They moved around each other like strangers at a dance, both careful not to step on the other's toes. It wasn't that Alice didn't love her mother. She did. In the complicated way you love someone who should have been there for you but wasn't. When her father died, Alice had needed her mother like never before. She had needed her to stay, to guide her through the grief, to be the steady hand she could cling to. Instead, her mother had folded into herself, consumed by her own loss, and then drifted away altogether. By the time Alice was 10, her mother had left to start over. New city, new husband, new family. She had promised they would visit. that they would stay connected, but promises, Alice had learned, were just words. And while her mother had moved forward, Alice had been left to navigate the wreckage on her own. Her aunt had stepped in, piecing together the broken shards her mother had left behind. Her aunt had been everything: mother, father, anchor. But even the warmth of her aunt's love couldn't erase the empty spaces her mother had left. Alice had tried to fill them with logic. Her mother hadn't left because she didn't love her. She'd left because she couldn't cope, because the grief had hollowed her out and made staying impossible. But knowing that didn't make it easier. Knowing that didn't erase the sting of abandonment. Over the years, Alice and her mother had found a fragile truce. One visit a year, enough to keep the thread between them intact, but not enough to truly repair the rift. It was her mother's attempt to reach out, and Alice's way of keeping the peace. But even during those visits, Alice kept her walls firmly in place. She shared what was necessary, no more. When her marriage had ended, she hadn't told her mother until the annual visit rolled around. She had delivered the news like a weather report, factual, emotionless, distant. Her mother's reaction had been polite concern, her words full of sympathy but devoid of connection. Alice hadn't expected anything more. That was their pattern, distant, strained, and carefully polite. And yet, her mother had tried. She had brought Alice books she thought she might like, talked about her stepchildren with the hope that Alice might show some interest, and sent birthday cards with words that were too carefully written to feel entirely genuine. It wasn't that Alice thought her mother didn't care. She did. But it was hard to care in a way that felt meaningful when you didn't know how to bridge the chasm of years and choices. Alice had tried to forgive her mother for leaving. She really had. She told herself that everyone grieves differently, that her mother's decision to leave wasn't a rejection of her, but a desperate attempt to survive. She had told herself that people make mistakes, but the anger lingered, like an ember she couldn't quite extinguish. It flared every time her mother mentioned her stepchildren or tried to smooth over the past with too bright smiles and too perfect words. And yet part of Alice longed for the connection she refused to let herself feel. She envied people who could call their mothers for advice, who could laugh over wine and talk about nothing in particular. Her mother wanted that now. Alice could see it, in the way she sent those cheerful messages, in her yearly visits, in her awkward attempts to connect. But for Alice, it felt too late. The distance between them was too vast, the years too heavy with what had been lost. Now, with her mother's visit just days away, Alice felt the familiar weight settle on her shoulders. She sighed and typed a quick reply. "Looking forward to seeing you." It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely a lie either. As she set her phone down, Alice's thoughts shifted to another looming event, the welcome party for Lily. 2 gatherings, each tugging at her in different ways, each threatening to disrupt the careful balance of her life. One event would force her to confront her past, and the other would thrust her into a future she wasn't sure she was ready for. Alice exhaled, pressing her hands flat against the counter as though bracing herself. It wasn't the kind of week she would have chosen, but like so many things in her life, it wasn't something she could avoid.